The Republican-controlled House Budget Committee is ready to fall in line with Donald Trump's agenda, passing a new budget proposal this week that calls for $4.5 trillion in new deficits through tax cuts and some deep cuts to federal spending, including mandatory spending, which covers programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and food benefits like SNAP. The Senate Budget Committee approved a conflicting resolution this week that doesn't address the issue of taxes. Democrats blasted the House proposal, saying it would harm the middle class. With us now is New York Times congressional reporter and Pulitzer Prize winner Luke Broadwater.
Luke, so much fun on Capitol Hill these days. You've got the House moving in one direction and the Senate clearly wanting to move in another. As NPR reports, Senate Republicans want to proceed with a two-bill approach in order to act more expeditiously on the president's priorities at the border and then return later this year to address extending tax cuts. The House has different considerations than the Senate. And it goes on to talk about how these separate bills could jeopardize its altogether, ness in the House and the Senate. What's your take on how this plays out given the realities of Capitol Hill? The Republicans don't have the majorities significant enough in the House to really bank on what they want passing. And then, of course, in the Senate, they're like, no, we're not doing that.
Yeah, of course it's a mess. I would think there's...
Sorry, Luke, but evergreen.
I was like, okay, it's like, how do you state the obvious, right?
Right. Well, I mean, if you've paid any attention out there in the country to what Congress has done over the past 2 years, they have a very hard time, the Republicans in Congress, getting on the same page, right? I mean, we've seen them throw out their speaker. We've seen them take weeks to try to get another speaker. They're just rife with divisions all the time. So I would say as a starting point, I think there's very low chance that this House approved budget ends up becoming law the way it's written right now. That said, Republicans have a sort of conflicting priorities here. There's a lot of talk on Capitol Hill and at the White House about shrinking the debt, right? $36 trillion in debt. At the same time, they want to pass these sweeping tax cuts, right? $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, which adds to the debt, right? So you have these two things that sort of can't both be happening at the same time unless you make deep cuts elsewhere in the government. And that's what the House budget calls for. It doesn't really identify all of the cuts, right, specifically where these cuts are going to come from, but it says you need to have $2 trillion worth of cuts in mandatory spending. And that's sparking some concern in some people's districts, right, because we're talking about cuts to food stamps, cuts to Medicare. And so that affects real people's lives in real congressional districts. And so you saw that party line vote this week. You saw Democrats raising a lot of alarms. And you saw even some moderate Republicans saying, hey, if these cuts go beyond sort of, what we can find, the small amounts of fraud or abuse that we can find, we're going to have problems with this budget moving forward.
Right. We've seen a lot of reporting out of red states and members that are starting to realize the ways in which this is going to impact their districts. Luke, can you talk for us about how this debate is playing out side by side with the reality of DOGE and the fact that Republican appropriators are no longer effectively appropriating? I mean, where do those two conversations intersect?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. We have... traditionally Congress has the power of the purse, right? That's in the Constitution. It's Congress that decides where things are spent or not spent. And what we're seeing now is that Elon Musk has come in with a lot of young guys. They have installed these guys at various agencies, and they're going through and they're slashing things. And sometimes their cuts are not what they say they are, right? They are doing sort of keyword searches for for certain terms in usaspending.gov, and they're hitting on things and they're misinterpreting what some of them are. And a lot of federal workers are scared right now because of how deep and sweeping some of these cuts are. I mean, trying to eliminate entire agencies, right? And these are agencies that were approved by Congress. But we're not seeing the pushback from Congress that one would expect, right? You would think in a country that has a long tradition of balance of powers that the legislative branch would stand up for itself and say, hey, Mr. President, Mr. Musk, you can't cut that. We authorize those funds. Those funds are supposed to go for that purpose. That's what Congress passed. Instead, what we're seeing is actually cheering on Capitol Hill as Elon Musk and President Trump cut certain things that have been approved by Congress. So it's kind of we always say things are unprecedented during the Trump's term, but it really is in this case where the legislative branch has sort of outsourced in some cases the power of the purse to the president.
Literally just gave it up, rolled over without even a little bit of a fight. It's insane. But then you got, and Michael noted this Politico piece for us, that Republican members in high-tax blue states are concerned that the plan doesn't leave enough room to expand the state and local tax deduction. Senate Republicans and some House hardliners aren't ready to give up on a competing two-bill plan. You've got Republican Representative who is a centrist out of California, David Valadao. His district is one of the 6 Hispanic majority Republican seats where more than 20% of households receive food aid benefits from the SNAP program, and it's being targeted under the Republican budget. None of this just makes any sense to me. I'm just like, what is going on, Luke? When you talk to the members, are they, at least the Republican members, at least privately, are they acknowledging that this is insane and the president is trampling on their, constitutional authority as a co-equal branch of government, but they're not going to do anything about it because they're scared to get primary? Are they at least aware of the hypocrisy here and the craziness?
Yeah, well, you have a lot of competing priorities in Congress, right? You have those blue state Democrats that you just mentioned and blue state Republicans that you just mentioned who want to see the state and local tax deduction be greater, so there's less of a tax burden on their citizens. And a lot of them are going to push for that to be added to these budget plans as this goes forward. At the same time, look, food stamps have been a long target of the right. They don't like them. They want to cut them. Which is interesting because that used to be the one program that Republicans really supported in terms of helping the poor because it actually went to food, right? You couldn't say, oh, they're wasting it on something else. It's actually, it's supposed to be sort of a smart poverty prevention program. But again, that's on the chopping block right now with this budget. And so you saw David Valadao speaking out about that. That's a moderate Republican. That's a seat that Republicans really need to hold if they want to keep their majority. So he has some sway in Congress because he's able to win in that district and he's able to speak up for more moderate values. So look, all these people are going to be weighing in. They're going to be fighting over this. You have the Freedom Caucus at the same time insisting on these $2 trillion in cuts. And the president wants his big tax cuts, $4.5 trillion. So, and it's like a 1 or 2 seat majority at any moment, depending on who's there and who's sick and who's out of town. So you lose 1 or 2 Republicans and you can't get the bill passed. So, yeah, look, I expect this to be a long, protracted fight. I expect it to get ugly. And, we're going to see some Republican on Republican violence.
Well, we're going to leave it right there. Luke Broadwater, thank you very much for joining us this morning.